I'm delivering to you right now the words that my congregation longs to hear, but never does. I am not going to preach. In fact, my friend Matt Hensley wishes he were here to hear me say that, even at this moment. And I say that not because we do not need preaching. Our needs at this moment are many, and they are profound. And I'll tell you, we need God to raise up a prophet among us. And we need to hear a word from him. Let's pray for him to do that. But tonight, instead of a prophet, you're going to have to make do with an armchair historian, a teller of our tales, a man who keeps company with the ghosts of our past. And I want to take a moment to talk about something that's been on my mind recently. As we approach the midpoint of the 2020s, I find that I cannot stop thinking about the 1920s and the 1930s and the experience of Southern Baptists through that time. It's the generation of my grandparents. Our ancestors entered the 1920s with some measure of gratitude. After all, they had survived a global pandemic, the Spanish flu in 1918, and they had survived a lengthy, tedious war, the Great War, World War I, from whom many Americans did not return. And as they embarked upon the time of the 1920s, they felt lucky that they were the ones who had made it through all of that. But the perils that they had survived had really only, they didn't know this, but they'd really only served as a prelude to the many obstacles that the ensuing 2 decades would bring upon them. Southern Baptists had a lot of problems in the 1920s and 1930s. We had socio-political problems. We didn't think we did in 1920 because in 1920, Baptists won the second biggest political victory that we'd ever won. Second only to the First Amendment guarantee of religious liberty. We won when the country enacted prohibition of beverage alcohol. You're laughing, but they didn't laugh about it. They had worked on that for decades. And in fact, one of the presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention, Joshua Levering, had been a candidate for the presidency of the United States of America as a member of the Prohibition Party. They had a third party, the Prohibition Party, that ran candidates for president. But our political victory became a problem for us. The backlash of public opinion during the Roaring '20s was swift and furious and wrong. I was just as a teetotaler myself, but that reaction was divided between people who were upset about what happened because they were devoted to speakeasies and bathtub gin, and on the other hand, people who didn't like those things but who felt revulsion against Al Capone and the violence that was spilling over into American society out of the organized crime syndicates that were peddling illegal brew. And so by 1928, Southern Baptists, who had served as automatic votes for the Democratic Party as long as there were Southern Baptists, were sharply divided by the nomination of a controversial presidential candidate who was ethically unacceptable to many among their ranks. Nominee Al Smith was a Roman Catholic and an imbiber who actively opposed prohibition, who had led to get rid of a Prohibition Act in New York when he was there. And he lost to Herbert Hoover when many Democrats in the South, many Southern Baptists, refused to vote for him. And so as the 1920s approached their sunset, so understand, the party that we were yoked to lost the election because we were divided and upset about who had been nominated. So as the 1920s approached their sunset, it was increasingly clear that when it came to politics and the culture, Southern Baptist teetotalers had won the battle and lost the war. The culture was moving sharply against them. So we had socio-political problems. We also had economic problems. The farm crisis of the 1920s saw plummeting prices for agricultural crops. Many The circumstances bankrupted many of the farmers who were a part of the Southern Baptist family. It all happened before the stock market crash in the Great Depression in 1929. If you follow the lyrics of the Alabama song, the other people recorded it before them, but the Song of the South, it says, somebody told us Wall Street fell, but we were so poor that we couldn't tell. And that was the situation for many Southern Baptists, for whom 1929 was something that happened far away, and they were already suffering. Back in 1919, when cotton was selling for 38 cents a pound, Southern Baptists had launched the 75 million campaign. And as a result of that, we were hoping to, $75 million, you probably don't grasp how much money that was at the time. But they were trying to raise in a few years more than the cumulative amount that Southern Baptists had ever raised in the entire history of the convention. Southern Baptists signed pledges. They were enthused by this. They signed pledges that amounted to much more than the goal. Not $75 million, but $92 million. But by 1932, the cotton that had been selling for 38 cents a pound was only selling for 5 cents a pound. And Southern Baptists only gave a little more than half of what they had pledged just years before. And some of our institutions had proceeded on the promise of $92 million, and much less than that came in, and they were in very difficult circumstances. Our economic problems were made worse by the fact that we faced leadership problems in the 1920s and 1930s. At the Foreign Mission Board, the treasurer was a man named G.N. Sanders. The news leaked out in 1927 that he had embezzled $500,000 of the money that Southern Baptists had enthusiastically and sacrificially given for the cause of the Great Commission. Right on the heels of that hard jab came the uppercut right after that at the Home Mission Board, their treasurer was a man named Clinton S. Carnes. The mission board had failed to check his background, and if they had, they would have discovered that he was a career criminal. He took nearly $1 million from the Home Mission Board and absconded with it and fled the country, and they finally caught up to him in Canada, but not before the terrible damage had been done to convention finances and to convention confidence in the institutions that were leading us. During this same period of time, Southern Baptists faced substantial internal conflict over doctrine. Those missionary Baptists who had departed Southern Baptist life 20 years beforehand were still actively accusing Southern Baptists of having kowtowed to episcopacy and mammon, as they said it. And those people were working actively to lure churches and entire associations out of the SBC on that basis. Then, J. Frank Norris alleged in 1921 that Baylor University was teaching Darwin's theory of evolution. The controversy rapidly spilled over into other states. Mississippi Baptists, for example, tried to mediate that conflict for 3 years at their annual meetings and local associational settings, and the process was not pretty. Friends, what I am describing to you are the circumstances that the Executive Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention faced in the earliest days of its existence. This is where we started. Oh, the idea was there beforehand. The convention was brimming with enthusiastic optimism in 1916 when they first advanced the idea of having the executive committee. If only the convention had gotten the executive committee to its institutional start in heady days like that. But instead, in the time it took to implement the idea of the executive committee, the circumstances changed, and it commenced its work in a milieu of monetary shortfalls, leadership scandals, doctrinal conflict, and political humiliation. The executive committee was not the only entity affected. Aren't you glad you came for my motivational talk? My alma mater, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, nearly did not survive. President Lee Scarborough made the difficult decision to just throw in the towel and close the seminary. He came to a meeting to do it, would have done it too, if the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary had not intervened at the last minute to save Southwestern Seminary with an infusion of emergency cash. All across the Southern Baptist Convention, we rightfully wondered whether our institutions, our people, and our mission would survive. Now, pause the history lesson for a moment to ask you a few questions. After all, my favorite thing to do is to make Southern Baptists lift their ballots. So let me just ask you this. I just told you the story of the barely averted failure of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. If you already knew that story before tonight, would you raise your hand? A few of you. I just told you the story of Clinton Carnes, the criminal who embezzled nearly $1 million from the Home Mission Board in 1929. If you already knew that story, would you raise your ballots? Thank you. You may lower them. I also told you about the controversial Al Smith presidential campaign. Who all knows about that? A few of you. There's a lot of our history that you really don't know, isn't there? There really is. But the impact of these events was profound. I told you my grandparents came of age during and survived the Great Depression and all these other events as Southern Baptists. Even 70 years later, the ordeals of the 1920s and the 1930s were still shaping their behavior. Did you know anyone closely who lived through those times, who knew that hunger, who knew those struggles? They shopped differently. They saved differently, dealt with waste differently, and viewed life differently because of 2 decades of hardship that they had survived. But even though the 1920s and 1930s were days of hardship for many people who lived in the United States during those days, including many Southern Baptists, we Southern Baptists cannot tell the story of those decades fully by recounting only the challenges. Guess what else happened during the 1920s? Amidst all these controversies, instead of allowing themselves to become embattled and distracted, Southern Baptists chose to be bold and courageous. At the very moment when people would be tempted to hunker down and ride out the storm, Southern Baptists gathered in Memphis, Tennessee in 1925 and chose instead to create the cooperative program and to adopt the Baptist faith and message. They had courage and grit that they put on display. If before tonight you have heard of the cooperative program and the Baptist faith and message, would you raise your hand? See, these two things, more of you know about them, don't you? Those are the things that have endured down through the years. These two things represent more than just a motion on the floor or a bureaucratic program. They represent a clear and compelling statement of a dream for cooperation among Southern Baptist churches. A dream in which we coupled the need for doctrinal compatibility with the hunger for fellowship in the work. And that vision for cooperation has survived for nearly a century. It survived World War II. It survived revival. It survived the Eliot controversy and the Broadman commentary controversy. And it survived the conservative resurgence of the Southern Baptist Convention. And it survived the change from Democratic hegemony in the Southern Baptist Convention to Republican hegemony in the Southern Baptist Convention. And from the age of Hoover to the age of Roosevelt to the age of Kennedy to the age of Reagan and down through today, that vision of cooperation has outlasted them all and has outshone them all over the passing of several generations. And I'll tell you, my grandparents' generation were shaped just as profoundly by the adoption of this vision of cooperative work as they were by the hardships that they endured. Because the same grandparents that I had who kept a rented meat locker with stored food in it just in case until the day that they died are the grandparents who would fire the preacher if they threatened to reduce giving through the cooperative program of the Southern Baptist Convention. And you've encountered some of those people in your churches. And you know what I'm talking about. That in the 1920s and 1930s, in the moment of our darkest despair, a vision inspired them so much that they remained true to it until the day that they died decades later. For them, 1925 was the year when, although dozens of reasons to throw in the towel and abandon our one sacred effort were easy to find, we chose instead to search hard for the reasons to lean in and cooperate harder. Those reasons may have been fewer, but they were weightier. And we allowed them to lead us. We are descended from those people. It only remains to be seen how far we have descended from them. And those who will descend from us are counting from us. They're counting on us, rather. I'm going to make this prediction. If Jesus tarries until 2125, and if he permits the Southern Baptist Convention to endure that long, Phil, I don't think they'll remember me or you. Well, maybe you, but not me. I don't think that they'll remember the names of our detractors and naysayers. Half of them, I don't know their name anyway. They've got an anonymous handle on social media that they're using. Those who follow us a century now will probably be disinterested in our debates, important as they are, just like you're probably disinterested in some of the things people fought about in the 1920s and 1930s. But I believe this, if we're able to bring our churches back to the table and find a working agreement to cooperate, one that reassures our fears and concerns and prioritizes the beliefs and the mission that unite us, that is something that will still be touching people a century from now. It will outlive us all. It will outshine us all. It's just a question of whether we can make ourselves look past the temporary problems to see the eternal possibilities. Okay, maybe I will preach just a little bit. I love that story in 1 Samuel 13 and 14 where the people of Israel, Saul's the king. They're in battle against the Philistines. Saul summoned up the men of Israel. The Philistines came and they had 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and an innumerable host of soldiers out on the field of battle. And we're told in chapter 13 that the people of Israel came and they followed Saul. And they're gathered around Saul. They followed Saul. But we're told that they followed Saul trembling. They were faithful. They gathered, but they were afraid. I hope that's not where we wind up. We who are gathered here at this meeting of the Executive Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention, we who have been entrusted with the reins of leadership at this critical moment, I pray that we will not be found merely faithful to gather, but so fearful that we tremble. Because that's not how Jonathan did things in chapter 14. While his dad was gathered with the trembling, Jonathan got his armor bearer and said, let's go get these Philistines. And so two went to battle against an innumerable host. And they defeated 6 men, 2 against 6. And they won with that advance guard, and their boldness and courage inspired those who had been trembling just a moment before. And as a result, with the Lord's help, they routed the enemy and came home victorious. Back in the 1920s and 1930s, our Jonathan was a man named Frank Tripp. He was a pastor of a church, John Yates, in St. Joseph, Missouri. He decided that he was not going to sit idly by while the cooperative work of our churches fell into ruin. But instead, his church continued to pay his salary while he devoted all of his time to going around the country and motivating Southern Baptists to reach into their pockets and rescue the work, and it succeeded. Southern Baptists rallied to the call, and the convention not only survived, but it was poised to succeed when the winds changed. The time of opportunity came, and God opened the doors. We do not lack money. Look at the houses our church members live in, the cars that we drive, the number of subscription services that we have to be able to watch whatever we want on TV whenever we want to watch it. Compare that to what Southern Baptists owned in the 1920s and 1930s when they stepped up and led us out of trouble. We do not lack money. We do not lack planning. We do not lack opportunity. God help us, what we lack is inspiration. I'll tell you, in the past year, the messenger body's made some major decisions. We had 3 churches that appealed their declaration that they were not in friendly cooperation with the SBC, and all those appeals were heard. All those appeals were lost. We amended the Baptist Faith and Message in less time than it takes us to adopt the agenda. We had the first vote on a proposed amendment to Article 3 of the convention's constitution. And I'll tell you, in all of those votes but one, I would have voted with the majority. And for all of them, including the one where I would have voted differently, I am thankful that the messengers made the decision and not me. I would rather lose votes in a fair and equitable process than win votes in a rigged system or rule in a dictatorship. It's just the way I feel. But understand me, I believe in the voice of the messengers. I believe in our polity. But I also do believe in the importance of leadership. It's just that leadership in the Southern Baptist Convention does not consist of telling the messengers what they have to do. It consists of inspiring Southern Baptists about what to dream. It consists of putting a vision of cooperation in front of them that will shape their actions and move them forward. A dream of cooperation carried us through the 1920s and 1930s, and it will carry us through the 2020s too. So my call to you tonight is this. We need to lose interest in those who tear down. The worst thing that happens among us, I just tell you, is this. It's when one of you comes and says, man, I tell you, that person over there is crazy, the things that they say that are damaging to Southern Baptist Convention. I don't know why anybody follows them. Did you see what they posted yesterday? You know? Think about it for a moment. It'll come to you. We need to lose our interest in those who tear down. And we need to commit our hearts to the great Savior who has given us the Great Commission. And if we do that, we need not gather in this place to tremble, because God will go before us and give us the victory. Thank you.